Who goes there?
Us, of course. Who'd you think?
Oh, well, then that's okay. Okay, who, may I ask, are you?
We're Rudolph and Hermie and Yukon Cornelius, sir. Who are you?
I'm the official sentry of the island of misfit toys.
A jack-in-the-box for a sentry?
Yes, my name is...
Don't tell me. Jack.
No, Charlie. That's why I'm a misfit toy. My name is all wrong. No child wants to play with a Charlie in the box, so I had to come here.
Where's here?
We're on the island of misfit toys. Here we don't want to stay.
We want to travel with Santa Claus in his magic sleigh.
A pack full of toys means a sack full of joys for millions of girls and for millions of boys. When Christmas Day is here,
The most wonderful day of the year.
A Jack in the Box waits for children to shout.
Wake up! Don't you know it's time to come out?
When Christmas Day is here, the most wonderful day of the year. Toys galore, scattered on the floor. There's no room for more, and it's all because of Santa Claus. A scooter for Jimmy,
A dolly for Sue.
the kind that will even say,
How do you do?
when Christmas Day is here, the most wonderful day of the year.
How would you like to be a spotted elephant? Or a choo-choo with square wheels on your caboose?
Or a water pistol that shoots jelly.
We're all misfits.
How would you like to be a bird that doesn't fly? I swim.
Or a cowboy who rides an ostrich.
or a boat that can't stay afloat.
We're all misfits.
If we're on the island of unwanted toys, we'll miss all the fun with the girls and the boys. When Christmas Day is here, the most wonderful, 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 wonderful day of the year.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host Anthony. Has a secret Maddox.
And I won't tell it to you. It's a secret.
Yeah, we got to keep these secrets for a long time.
Do you have a secret too?
I also have a secret, and we got to keep these secrets for so long.
Yeah, it is a really long time. I think we should definitely do some secret off-the-record records so that we can then, we're banking on the podcast.
Oh, now you're spoiling that the secret is related to the podcast.
No, it's not. But it could be.
Why would we record anything about it if
fine.
it didn't have anything to do
Anyway,
with the podcast?
Secrets are no fun.
It's one of the things about me. I don't want anyone to tell me information in confidence ever. I don't want to have to remember what information I can't tell to other people.
That's a great point.
I don't like keeping secrets.
And that's why you didn't become a medical doctor.
One of the many reasons. One of the
just one of the reasons.
Many reasons. We got to get to our main topic, Anthony, because I'm convinced. I think this episode is a chance to be an all-timer. I actually had to check back at our full 282 episode plus archive to make sure we had not recorded this episode before, because it came to me and I was like, surely we've already recorded this episode, and apparently we have not. I just want to talk about bad cards.
I agree. I think it's just that every episode of this podcast is to some degree about defending bad cards, or at least often enough that it does feel like this is a topic we've covered kind of ad nauseum. But
our
I guess
most
let's
mentioned
do it.
cards of all time are Lightning Bolt and Oko, basically. So
and White Maned Lion and Ornithopter and
okay, sure.
Let me just say, I don't know. I can't think of a card now. Name a card. Name
any card.
Terravore. I'm going to name Terravore 300 times.
I think it's worth talking about bad cards. This is one of the more interesting episodes of Drive to Work I remember listening to, and Mark Rosewater has a famous article, which is called When Cards Go Bad, I think is the name of the original editorial. What was this thing called? His column. And I think Mark has had to deal with people asking him over the years to stop printing bad cards, and why do you have to print bad cards, and simply don't print bad cards. And that's sort of one way to engage with this idea is people want Magic to stop printing bad cards. And there's reasons why bad cards have to exist for Magic more broadly. But when I listened to that episode again recently in preparation for this episode, it occurred to me that I think a lot of Cube designers, whether they realize it or not, are essentially following the same logic as those throngs of people asking Mark Rosewater to stop playing bad cards when they just try to not put any bad cards in their cube.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is just a sort of understood expectation or factors into people's decision-making that even if you're not saying, I want to play with all the most powerful cards, if I give you 2 cards, I mean, the example that I always go to is you got Lightning Bolt and you got Shock. You will look at those two and just be like, well, Lightning Bolt is a better card. I, as a Magic player, will intuitively make this assessment because I'm not an idiot. Of course, Lightning Bolt is a better card. Then you conflate that, better as a game piece or, better as a piece for me to have in the game with a better game piece that is better for the game overall, and you will just choose the Lightning Bolt. And I think that many players do this somewhat intentionally, but I think that even players that are trying to do things a little bit off the beaten path will still kind of fall into that default pattern of comparing 2 cards and assessing them on power level and conflating power and quality.
And we should say there was a moment there where it looked like maybe Parker would be able to join us for this episode, but instead he has written a little article. It's going to come out, I think, alongside this episode, which will have some of the same ideas in it. I want to mention up top to go check out Parker's article about this. Parker's talking about bad cards very specifically in the context of Cube, and I want to address that, but I also think we should talk about them more broadly because I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there. Can we just start in our most traditional and pedantic way? What is a bad card, Anthony?
Wow, I don't even know how to qualify it. Usually I feel like there's a more concrete thing for me to add a bunch of qualifications on. I don't know, I guess just as a player, if you're looking at a pile of cards and you're like, well, here's my cool 3-mana 4/4 that I'm going to put in my deck and is going to stop my opponent, that's great, and here's a bunch of draft chaff that I'm never going to play and is not relevant to any format ever. Those are the bad cards.
Yeah, there's so many ways to look at this. I think one of the most easy ways is within a given competitive context. Like in Legacy, a bad card is X, where you can describe cards that are bad in Legacy. You can even describe them sort of deterministically or prescriptively. I'm not sure what the right word is, where you just say a bad card is one that has a low win rate when put in a deck. It brings the win rate of your deck down if you play it. That is a bad card.
That's a good concrete definition. And I think there are good examples, or easy to talk about examples like Shock versus Lightning Bolt, where there is a strictly better relationship. This card just does more. But it also there might just be a card that is totally different, there's no replacement for it, but your Scornful Egoist just can't make sense in Legacy no matter what. It just isn't a viable card.
Be careful what you say.
Okay.
Because that card is very weird and unique, and it's
very
possible.
Weird.
I believe there was a brief period of time where people were playing it alongside Eldritch Evolution.
Okay, that's cool.
Because you can get a high mana value permanent into play. Then they figured out that Allosaurus Rider was better at that, because you could play Allosaurus Rider for free.
Right.
I believe it's mana value 7 or something. Anyway.
But yeah, I think that in the context of any particular constructed format, it's much easier to look at and define, because there's going to be, 1,000 cards, maybe. I'd actually be curious to know what the hard numbers are, but I think we can talk pretty confidently in the abstract. There's going to be this chunk of cards that are relevant, and you can play competitive.
1,000. It's much lower.
It's lower.
It's a much lower number in competitive Legacy.
But, compared to the, what is it now, 30,000 cards that are playable in Legacy, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of cards that make any sense in a competitive sense.
Mm-hmm. So we can look at it that way. I think it's a pretty concrete definition. You could just, if you had win rates for every deck, or you could say with some sort of time-traveling supercomputer that this card, when inserted into this deck, makes your win rate worse. You can at least say in pretty concrete terms, this card is bad for this deck, in this meta, in this format, which is already a lot of qualifications, right? That same card in a different deck might make the win rate go up, or in the same deck, but in world where the meta has shifted slightly. Not legal cards, not the card pool that is actually able to be played, but just the way that players reckon about what is strong or weak in the format could completely change the power level of a card.
Right. Somebody finally breaks the Scornful Egoist deck, and now something else that destroys Scornful Egoists goes up in value, but maybe not that much.
Yeah, Scornful Egoist also pretty good against Prismatic Ending.
Interesting.
We're really cooking now.
Let me write this cube idea down.
We're really cooking now. So even that, which I think is maybe the most concrete way we could describe what a bad card is already fraught with a ton of qualifiers, because it's actually hard to say truly what a bad card is in Legacy in sort of an objective sense, or modern or standard. Choose your format of choice. And obviously, we talk a lot about Cube in this podcast. I think you could probably, look at a given cube, and say, okay, well, here is a self-contained meta, a self-contained format. What are the bad cards in this list? And you might be able to derive some of the bad cards. But that's going to be even harder than looking at a constructed format because you don't have a bunch of playtest data around around results, right? You're going to have just like a statistically insignificant number of actual results. And so you're really just kind of using abstract heuristics to guide what you think is a good or bad card. And then obviously if it's just like Magic more broadly, like can you ever say a card is just bad in Magic? I'm not even sure you really honestly can. Like your example of like Lightning Bolt versus Shock, but I would never call Shock a bad card, right? Would you?
I mean, it's interesting. I feel like Shock kind of gets this pass because it's often relevant in limited formats, or maybe it's relevant for a while in Standard where Lightning Bolt just doesn't exist. Yeah, so maybe that's a difficult example. Whereas if then we take the next example of what even is a 1-mana deal 1 spell?
Lava Dart, which is incredibly powerful.
Well, but that's not a good example either.
Needle Drop is 1 mana for 1 damage to a creature that's already been dealt damage this turn.
Okay, let's do this differently.
And draw a card.
Instead of Shock, let's go Lightning Bolt, Lightning Strike, and Open Fire, which is the 3-mana deal 3. So we're just scaling up the mana, keeping the effect the same. And I think Open Fire doesn't have that same kind of like affection, because players, maybe they remember it as like, oh, this was kind of marginal in its limited format. It wasn't still pretty good.
I feel like it had to be pretty good in Amonkhet, right?
I wasn't very good at limited at that point. I was just getting started.
I still feel like a 3-mana Bolt for that era I would play pretty highly, but I don't actually remember. Amonkhet limited spikes, sound off in the comments. How do you rate Open Fire?
So I think you're right that we are not pulling from one kind of cohesive, singular opinion of card quality. It's like, it's multifaceted because Magic is many games coming out of one system.
So I think we can pretty safely say that what a bad card is very complicated and dependent on lots of context and qualifying information.
That we can say concretely.
Can we look at the inverse? Like, is it easier to define a good card, and then can we just say that bad cards are any card that is not good?
I think so. I mean, yeah, it would just be the inverse, right? It's like these are the cards that have competitive viability.
But I'm saying is there any way in which it is easier to describe good cards than bad cards that provides more clarity?
I think it's most easy to evaluate a card when it's like coming new to a format because you sort of have some sense of rate. Like imagine people have been playing Standard for a while. They've kind of brute forced the system and figured out what are the cards that make sense, have competitive viability. And then looking at a new card being introduced to the format, you can kind of use benchmarks of what's present and say, okay, well, a 2-mana 3/3 doesn't really cut it. A 2-mana 4/4, sure, that's like above the rate that makes sense. So that could have some competitive viability. And then there's all the kind of like knock on and weeds of like, well, do we understand the metagame? Is this a relevant creature type? Are there removal spells that are already being played that target this particular spell? So maybe that's an easier way to look at it of like, here's one card entering a known meta.
Yeah, I think really what you're describing is that when tasked with trying to describe the power level of a card in the abstract, you are just reaching for as specific a comparison as you can get. You can just say like, well,
right.
If we know that Lightning Strike is good in this format, then Lightning Bolt is also going to be good in this format, right? Like you're trying to get as concrete as possible because the more hyper-specific you can get, the more you can actually make a claim that makes any sense.
I sort of find it interesting that for a lot of common effects, I think we have a good sense of what the going rate is and what makes sense. Like for a damage spell, like 2-mana 3 damage, you might be looking at your standard environment and saying, yeah, this is reasonable. This is like playable, or maybe in a limited format or in your particular cube. And same you could say for creature sizes. 2-mana 2/2, is this above rate or below rate or on rate? Even something like a draw spell. I feel like, we've had conversations before where it's like, well, what would Ancestral Recall properly costed be? And we're both like, 5. That's what the rate is for that.
I'm going with 4 just for the
record.
record.
You're going with 4? We've updated that.
Well, I guess is it an instant? It is an instant,
It is an instant,
But
yeah.
5 then,
okay,
never mind.
great. So there's some like obvious comparisons we can draw and sort of define like where is that rate and maybe even that spectrum of rate of, here's what it was in limited in 2015, here's what it is in limited in 2025. But sometimes when a new effect just can't really be fit into anything, it's much, much more difficult to evaluate. And I think that something like Treasure Cruise, when Delve came out, it was like, well, we don't really know how quickly you're going to fill the graveyard. So like there's a lot of context that matters before we can really evaluate this correctly. Or Oko was a card, just because we're talking about bad cards, let's talk about Oko and how everybody really kind of didn't know what to do with it because it was just such a weird card. People didn't have a strict comparison to fit it into the kind of gameplay they were used to. And so a lot of people did not evaluate it correctly at first.
That one also has the added rub of, I remember for like a day or two, Oko was spoiled, but no one knew what food was yet. And so everyone got kind of hung up on the idea that, like, well...
It's good depending on how good a food is.
It depends how good a food is. And it turns out that it doesn't actually matter. Because when foods were then spoiled, everyone was like, oh, it just gains 3 life. That's not very good.
Right, that's interesting.
Therefore, Oko must not be that good. But really, honestly, it could make, like, a
scrap token, just an artifact that does nothing.
It would be, still extremely strong, because the idea of getting a 3/3 every other turn on your 3-mana Planeswalker that comes down and upticks to 6 loyalty or 5 loyalty? A lot. Upticks to a lot of loyalty is already quite good. So, yeah, I think it's worth talking a little bit about, like, common patterns to bad cards absent context, because if we've successfully established that what a bad card is depends so much on context, then it can very quickly become a useless term. It's not even worth talking about. But I do think that there are patterns to cards that tend to be bad that you have to learn as a Magic player and as a Cube designer that are worth being explicit about. Obvious things like cards with a really high mana cost that have no alternate casting mode or whatever tend to be quite bad, because you only can play them at a certain part of the game. By that part of the game, those cards have to have a massive comeback potential, or you might just get them counterspelled or something, right? Like, it's just inherently a very sort of risky thing to put a card that costs a ton of mana in your deck. And similarly, I think any card that is high risk, whether it's for mana value or not, is also, generally speaking, a pattern of a pretty bad card, right? I'm thinking here of, like, 4 or 5 drop creatures with just no enter the battlefield, leave the battlefield, die trigger. That's just like a creature that you're just like, I hope no one removes this, otherwise it does nothing. That kind of card, I think, can struggle to be competitively viable. It's not always true, right? Like, Elder Gargaroth was a card that was competitively viable because it was so pushed on so many other directions that it could get away with having that play pattern of being a 5-mana creature that doesn't do anything until you get to attack or block with it. But it's rare. I think, generally speaking, you should, be cognizant of cards like that.
Would you break these up into sort of different patterns? Like, I could see one pattern being, it's like, this is just too high a mana cost. It's unlikely in a given format, a given environment, that you're going to be able to cast this card at all. Therefore, it is risk. Another maybe subtle difference is just thinking about it in terms of rate and being like, well, this card is just below rate, which could be a 7-mana 5/5, but it could also be a 3-mana 1/1 creature. And, similarly, you could talk about that rate in damage spells and draw spells and removal spells and all kinds of things like that. And maybe the third kind of thing you hinted at is then the value against removal. Like, how does my creature stack up against, there's 1 mana removal in this format, so even a 4-mana creature that isn't going to generate any value in the face of that removal is going to be sort of out of sync and not really in dialogue with that scale of removal.
See, even there, your comments highlight how important it is to have context, right? Because I'm trying as much as possible to, be removed from any idea of rate, which is specific to a particular format or meta, and to be removed from what the removal looks like. But as soon as you start, picking it apart at all, it becomes relevant, because it's like, okay, well, a 5-mana 6/6 with no ETB or leave the battlefield ability and some value on attack or block can be very good if the only removal in the format is toughness based. If it's just damage or toughness based removal, it can be really hard to remove that 6 toughness creature. So it is all ultimately context dependent. Really, what I think it comes down to is bad cards are cards that are too conditional, right? And a high mana value card is just conditional on you having gotten to the late part of the game where you have 8 or 9 mana or whatever. And a creature that's, got no enter the battlefield ability or whatever is conditional on it sticking and getting to attack and your opponent not having interaction for it. And, a card maybe with a huge downside that I think of. I think it's interesting to talk about cards like Lion's Eye Diamond, which is a card that I think is, in some ways, a bad card. It's got a massive downside.
I think that to talk about that card specifically, that card was designed to be a bad card. It was designed to be a joke and be like, well, what if we made Black Lotus, but it sucked?
And to be fair, I think it did.
It did. It took
for a long time
for them to print a bunch of weird kinds of cards that just matter around.
It didn't take them that long to get to Yawgmoth's Will. That was only a couple of years.
I don't know if that was actually the point where it became broken, but there's a lot of cards that work with Lion's Eye Diamond that have been printed in the last couple of years even.
But I do think cards with big downsides are essentially conditional on you having drawn and been able to resolve the thing that negates that big downside, right? I love Phyrexian Dreadnought. I think it's safe to call that a kind of bad card. Now, obviously, you can make it very powerful in the right context, but the fact that it is conditional on being in that context has massive implications on your deck building, your sequencing, and how games play out that are all about trying to sort of negate how bad of a card this is and turn it into a good card.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that I want to talk about is how fun and satisfying it is to be in that moment of when you discover how to turn a bad card into a good card. But I think that maybe exploring this definition a little bit more is helpful. I think that narrowness is really a key component of it. Like, if you have a card that just says, destroy target elf, it's like, okay, maybe this destroys a couple creatures in this environment, but not consistently. It's just not going to contribute to a consistent win rate. That's obviously a really explicit, really narrow example, but it could be that it's a damage spell that only does 2 damage, and most things have 3 damage in this environment. Or it's destroy target enchantment, and there's just not enough enchantments for it to make sense.
Yeah, it could be 1 and a white, destroy target enchantment, draw 6 cards. And it's like, well, if there aren't enchantments here, I mean, you're going to put a lot of enchantments in your own deck at that point to try and, make that card castable.
Assuming, we're not in 2025 where it says destroy up to 1 target enchantment. Or it says,
modern R&D patterns. Shots fired at modern R&D patterns.
And I think that narrowness can also just be like operating on an axis that gameplay doesn't tend to care about, like a 4-mana destroy target land. Not that relevant in a lot of formats. Definitely could be if the format really revolves around playing your 5 and 6 drops, but that's just not going to be the case in many environments where by the time you have 4 lands, destroying one of your opponents is not really just going to matter that much.
Mm-hmm. What about a card like Doomsday? Do you think Doomsday counts as like a bad card in the same sense? Lose half your life rounded up, do not affect the board, make your library 5 cards.
But it's a specific 5 cards.
It's funny, I just think this class of cards, honestly, this is a class of cards I've been thinking a lot about for Take 5, and this is not going to be a Take 5 episode because I want to keep this more evergreen, but that new Cube list, I think, is largely about trying to make cards like Sundial the Infinite, Doomsday, Phyrexian Dreadnought, these kinds of cards that on their face are like, well, that's kind of bad, but has the potential to maybe be good, and then making them good. And that, I think, is a point of real joy. Before we keep pulling that thread, though, I'm truly just like making this up on the fly, but I wonder if we can like define bad cards as one axis is that conditionality, that sort of narrowness, like how often is this card relevant, how often does it do what I want, and that can be kind of close to objective. I mean, a lot of those things are going to care a lot more about the format, right? Like, how good is disenchant? That depends entirely on the meta. We can't really say in sort of any abstract sense how good that is. How good is, 12 mana, you win the game with no alternate casting cost or whatever. Like, it's going to be entirely dependent on whether or not there are weird ways to cheat that spell onto the stack or something, right? Like, you're not going to cast that in really any format of Magic, save for like Commander, which we're going to take off the table right now just for ease of conversation. Because I think the other sort of rate that is worth discussing is not in context of a given meta or a given format, but in context of like Magic's, what are the names for the constants? Like, what are the names for the constants in like the universe as we understand them in physics? Isn't there a name for like certain
constants?
I thought it was a like modifying adjective to describe the constants.
You're talking like the speed of light and Planck length.
Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Just physical constants.
Okay, sure. Well, I think we can look at like Magic's constants for most formats, which, cards have been power crept over the years. There's no doubt that a creature in 2025, 2026 is way better than your average creature in 1995 or 1996. The starting life total is still 20. Your starting hand size is still 7. You still play 1 land a turn. Other cards can modify that. But like, for the most part, like, those constants of the game have not changed. And a lot of times you can look at a card's rate relative to those constants and say with some objective sense that it doesn't really matter where you're playing this card is good or bad, right? Like, Ancestral Recall is just good. It does not matter what format you put it into. Getting 3 of the starting, resource that you only have 7 of to begin the game for only 1 land drop, but you get 1 of each turn. Those things are constants in a way that, like, I think that card will just always be good, and it does not matter how other cards are power crept in Magic. That will just remain a fairly constant thing. And I think that also speaks to the idea of like this sort of maybe universal vanilla test, right? We were describing it like, oh yeah, like a 2-mana 4/4 that's good. And it is. It's just paying only 2 mana for a thing that gets sort of a fifth of your opponent's life total, right? Like, your life total has not changed. So a 2-mana 4/4 is probably good in almost any context of Magic until you start talking about things like Legacy, where you have to have your 2 drops be Murktide Regions. They have to be 8/8 flyers, not, 4/4s. But
you've already found an exception to your constant.
Well, there are exceptions, but
I think that this is really interesting and something that I struggle with a little bit, because I often, especially when talking about, playing with bad cards and why I think it's great to do in Cube, is the numbers don't matter. It's all relevant.
I'm glad you went here.
It's a closed system. Like, if we say, okay, let's take the creature, let's double the power or double the toughness, and here's our removal spell, double the amount of damage it does, we are playing with effectively the same pieces. They just have different numbers, but it doesn't really matter. And I think that there are lots of cases in Magic, like you look at little slices of interactions in the game where that is true. And you could just say like, hey, we can just tweak the numbers up and down and still have the same system.
There is literally a card with infinity power in the game. So
yeah,
what better example than there being that you can just kind of arbitrarily choose whatever you want.
But there are some of these, like you're saying, like we generally, except for the looming most popular format of Magic.
Except for the most popular format in the room that we will not be speaking about.
We generally do not change the starting life total and number of cards that you draw every turn. Those constants, I think, do matter, but I still think that this idea that, like, you can just tweak either the explicit numbers on the card or this vague power level that we don't actually have a number from, but we have a reasonable sense of, in a lot of cases, you can tweak that up or down for all the cards within an environment, and it would not meaningfully actually change it. Your example of ancestral recall is interesting. So what if we can just sort of assume that there is this general principle that, like, you can't design cards of equal power level. There's going to be a mixture, even if you tried to, and there are lots of reasons Wizards does not try to design cards with all equal power level. That, okay, you said less than 1,000 cards in Legacy are viable, so that's...
I mean, I have to imagine, I would guess that of the competitive meta, like 95+% of the cards are from a pool of like less than 100 would be my guess.
Okay, well, that's a small number. So let's just assume then, like, given
your small number messed up my back of the napkin.
Given a pile of cards, 2% will be relevant to a constructed environment. Is that fair? Like, well,
sure.
That's not a correct number. That's totally transportable,
sure.
But let's assume that. You can imagine that like an iceberg, and maybe 2% of our iceberg is sticking up above the water because that's the difference in buoyancy between the ice and the water. That's also not the correct number, but
it's a really heavy iceberg.
It's a very heavy
very
iceberg.
Dense.
It is very unsalty water. Don't worry about it. So 2% of our iceberg is sitting above the water. If we add more snow on top of that iceberg, it can never expand. Like, it can never make our iceberg taller because it's just going to push down more, and 2% more will be visible again. And I feel like that's
if you're adding a bunch of material to it, then 2% will be a bigger number.
That's absolutely correct. I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because now no one else has to point that out to me. Because I think that the metaphor still kind of stands that you can keep piling more cards on and something is going to fall off the bottom. Like, you just can't necessarily make more better cards, even though that seems so intuitive to a player when you're playing a game to be like, well, this card sucks. Why did they bother printing that? They should have just printed more like this. But if they had, then something else would be pushed off the bottom of your iceberg and underwater.
I don't think what you're describing is actually 100% true, because...
What percent true do you think it is?
Let's start making up more numbers.
Of conversation we're having here.
No, I think it's like you can definitely, in a given cube, in a given constructed meta, have a like really broad meta or a really narrow meta. And I do think it is possible to print cards that broaden or narrow the meta. I think the interesting thing is that what makes for a narrow meta usually is just too powerful cards. Like, when the cards are too good, then it really narrows down what you can do. And I think it's pretty safe to say that like the Legacy meta is narrower than the Modern meta, because your deck in Legacy has to have a plan for a deck that's going to play, you know, a turn 1 Dragon's Rage Channeler and back it up with Force of Will and Daze and have Wasteland. And then like we follow it up with a turn 2 Murktide Region if possible, right? Like, those cards are so good that if you can't compete with those, you are irrelevant. And as such, we see that, like, you know, blue is pretty much always the most dominant color in Legacy, and that's a choice that Wizards of the Coast has made because they want that for that format, I think, and that's what the identity of the format is. But the presence of those powerful cards inherently makes the format narrower. And so I think, you know, in your sort of iceberg metaphor, like, maybe if we're not looking at like the volume of ice above the water, but like the surface area, right? Like, if you had a really pointy tip of the iceberg where it's like 2% is sticking out, but it's all isolated in this one sort of vertical column of like really thin ice, versus like a really wide top where you could look at it from the top and be like, oh, there's actually I could stand on the top of this iceberg. Or these metaphors are really getting out of hand. I worry we're pushing
this metaphor a little bit far.
Really getting out of hand. But
I mean, here's my point is, I think that if the shape of that argument kind of makes sense, and allow it to be squishy in the details, you could absolutely say, like, well, let's power creep Ancestral Recall. Let's make an Ancestral Recall that draws 4 cards. Let's make one that costs 0. Let's make one that also makes a 1/1 creature token. Let's make one that also makes my opponent discard a card. There are endless ways that we could power creep that card. It would be totally reasonable to say, let's print 900 new cards that are better than Ancestral Recall, and now Ancestral Recall
that would not be totally reasonable.
Has been
citation needed.
Reasonable in one sense, and it would push Ancestral Recall to being a bad card. It just is no longer viable in our crazy meta. And here's where I think your idea of like there are constants. There is the life total, there is the 1 card per turn. That game where we print those 900 better than Ancestral Recall cards
Sucks.
Would totally just interact with those constants in bizarre ways and be unrecognizable from a game of Magic that we have a frame of reference for. I don't agree with you totally that we could never power creep certain effects. So I would say, like, yeah, we can't do it without drastically changing the game into something very unrecognizable.
Sure. I think we're in total agreement on that. I certainly was not trying to say there's no way to ever print cards better than Ancestral
That's what
Recall.
you said.
It's
You said
impossible
it.
to do it. I think we should move on to a defense of bad cards. We've spent at least half the episode talking about how to possibly identify or define them, and you listening probably have your own ideas for how you might identify or describe bad cards. As we said at the beginning, I think most cube designers tend to just put quote-unquote good cards in their cube and think of their cube as a thing where they want to play with a bunch of good cards. And I want to push back on that idea because I don't actually think that is a particularly good way to look at the format. And I think as designers, if people were to broaden their horizons a little bit to include playing with bad cards, they might find a lot of joy in places they wouldn't expect. I have a list I made of like reasons to play bad cards when good cards exist. But do you, before I start just going down my list, have thoughts on the virtues of bad cards?
Absolutely. I mean, as the regular cube creator, this has been a drum that I've been beating for years. I don't know. Like, I don't know which direction to look at this from, because I just think that a lot of cards that are no longer viable in constructed formats or in, like the limited format doesn't exist are just really fun cards that I have memories with. I enjoy playing with them. And so for me, if we're allowed to narrow it down to Cube specifically, I think that's one of the best things that the opportunity that Cube provides is that I can scale down the whole environment. I can be in control of that context. So even though I can no longer go to a modern tournament and say like, hey, what if we just like play with this old deck and like, can we just agree to play at this power level? That's not really going to work. People say it works in Commander, but I'm skeptical.
Citation needed.
But in Cube, you're in control of that whole sandbox, and you can just say, like, I enjoy playing with this card. Let's make that viable. Let's make that rate viable. Let's make that downside actually worth it, because this effect now is the most efficient version you have access to, or is really critical because it interacts with the other best threats in this environment. For me, I guess what I'm saying is playing bad cards is kind of the thing I already want to do, so I'm using Cube as a way to allow me to do that, so I don't really see the reason to have to argue for why bad cards are good.
I do think there is just a deep-seated societal, maybe like fundamentally human bias towards like powerful stuff. Like people just think strong is good and weak is bad, right? Mark Rosart talks about this in his podcast, and he actually like references fuses, and it's like fuses are a thing that are weak, and it's good that they're weak. And it's interesting, we can't come up with very many examples of things that are where it's a benefit to society that they are weak because, just human psychology as such a sort of preference, like probably from deep-seated evolutionary whatever, for like strength.
I think that is more of a cultural thing, and I think that there are lots of examples where quote-unquote weakness is actually a more effective trait, but I think that is too much of a rabbit hole to go into here.
I'm really curious. Hit me with a couple.
I mean, I was just listening to a really interesting podcast about the concept, maybe this is not quite there, but the concept of the alpha male wolf, which has turned into this like, oh, we're making this a cultural or a moral or social value, that like being the alpha is a positive thing.
We're talking about Andrew Tate on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Turns out that the entire like thing that was based on, the fact that wolves have this alpha male structure and you have to fight to become the alpha male, and then you are in control and given what you deserve. Totally wrong. And the person who published it, who first came up with this idea, has recanted it and tried for most of his career to try and get his work to be unpublished because it's wrong. Turns out he was looking at some research dealing with captive wolves that were put in this like really specific, bizarre situation where like somebody
you're
did
saying
fight.
Context matters.
Context matters. And he then took that and compared it to the wild wolf populations, was like, oh, well, this seems like the same role and they must follow the same sort of pattern. Turns out those were just father wolves. It was just a family structure, and there wasn't this like battle for
dads
fights.
Are just toxic.
It was just like dads were just good. Like the children respected their father, and like the father would sacrifice in situations for the good of their pack. And it was just this like bizarre conflation of like noticing some similarities and then misapplying that idea of like violence and a struggle being necessary for the pack structure. And it's still there. It's still just in our society. We don't talk about like that sign of like
all the time.
Humility in leadership as being a thing of value.
I don't think that's at all what I'm talking about, but I think it's very interesting.
That's what I've been thinking about a lot this week.
I think it's very interesting, and that thing happens all the time, right? I always think about the fact that the guys that made the crop circles
oh my God.
came out and just said, like, hey, it's been like 30 years. We figured we just, we did it. It's us. Here's how we did it. We had these, like, 4x4s and, like, stomped them down. Here's actually some photos we took of us doing it. And a bunch of people that believe in aliens and believe in crop circles were like, you were lying. That's a psyop. That's you trying to throw us off the trail. And they're like, nope, it's us. And everyone's like, no, you're wrong. It's also the same thing for the stupid, like, vaccines cause autism, lie, which is all from one paper that was first of all completely debunked and then was also completely misinterpreted and, like, presented the wrong way. Society doesn't care about truth.
But we could.
I still think, broadly speaking, like, you're just kind of redefining strength, but you're not saying there's not a value in strength. Like, you're just saying you can define it differently by saying, actually, maybe you should be self-sacrificing or humble or whatever, but there's still a sort of implicit value in strength there.
You know what? Let's come back to this in a future episode when we have time to think about what we mean by our words.
This will be an episode of Magic Doesn't Exist, which we have to get back to recording now that we are back on schedule. Anyway, I at least agree with Mark Rosewater that I do think that there is a, like, subtle bias. Maybe not so subtle, but definitely
significant bias.
Definitely a bias towards just like, strong, like, good stuff's better, right? And that doesn't really make any sense in the context of game design, right? Like, you don't want the game to be easy to win. If it's easy to win for one player, then it's obviously, the other player had no chance, right? And it's inherently a, like, zero-sum person-v-person game. You don't just design the game pieces to be as powerful as they possibly can be, because that's never your goal. Your goal is to create interesting games, and that's just a lesson that, like, is so plainly obvious to any game designer or to Mark Rosewater that I think a lot of cube designers need to hear, because they just think, well, I'll put more powerful cards in my cube, and great games will just naturally come from that because great, powerful cards make for good games of Magic, and I just don't think there's any truth to that at all. I think that's a complete fallacy.
You could take the example of Lightning Bolt and make better Lightning Bolt that does 4 damage and think, well, that's a better card, I'll put it in my cube now. And if you just take that to its absurd extreme of it's 1 mana, deal 20 damage, well, cool, you've designed a game that now is just who plays a mountain and best Lightning Bolt on turn 1. Great. You might hear that example and say, well, like, obviously we wouldn't do that. That's an absurd extreme. It doesn't make sense at that point. But there's not a ton of numbers in between 3 and 20. Like, there's not a lot of space to work with in there.
Big hot take from Anthony.
Listen, I can name many more numbers.
I would say there's infinity numbers between 3 and 20, but that's just me.
There aren't a lot of integers in between 3 and 20. Great catch. Thank you for catching all of these misspokes.
Nailed it. From a cube design perspective, I think the first thing to mention, which we've talked about a million times in this podcast, is that cards that are worse are part of a broader spectrum of mutually playable cards. If you are trying to play Magic's most powerful cards, you are kind of priced into playing all of Magic's most powerful cards, because if you put 50 of them in, then the other, 210 cards in that cube, 310 cards in that cube, are either going to have to be the next, 210 most powerful cards, or they're just going to be woefully, completely outclassed by those most powerful cards and not matter at all. And then they're just kind of taking up space and offering a sort of promise to your players that is never going to be delivered on, because you thought it might be cool to do this thing, but it turns out your opponent just has Narset Wheel of Fortune, and then you just get absolutely obliterated. And so if you want more options as a cube designer, more choice, more agency over what the packs look like, what the decks look like, what the games look like, the texture of those actual turns, then you should play at a lower power level, because it gives you more cards to choose from.
Yeah, I think that's
objectively
absolutely
true.
And I think that's true in a couple different ways. Like, playing at a lower power level gives you more selection. For one thing, a lot of people have already explored and made cubes these are the most powerful cards. So just doing any lower power level is going to be space to explore new cards and play with something that you haven't played with before. I think also there are legitimately just fewer cards at that, like, really high power level. It's like, here's Ancestral Recall. There's not a lot yet that's really comparable to it. But if you dip down to a lower power level, like, let's take maybe the Lightning Bolt example, dip down into your 3 mana Lightning Bolts, there's a whole bunch of Lightning Bolts that are 3 mana, deal 3, and then do a little upside, or make a token, or proliferate. And that's just a lot more options of different cards to experiment with. And then the last way I think it gives you more options and more flexibility is if you're playing at that peak of power level, all the different kinds of effects you might want to include are not necessarily in balance, because here's the most powerful reanimation spell and here's the most powerful damage spell. Those might not be in the sort of alignment and balance that you want for a cube. If you're playing at a much lower power level, you have not just the opportunity then to tune down one effect and say, well, let's choose the slightly worse version of this. You also then have the opportunity to tune up something else and say, like, okay, well, because I started with things that are sort of in the middle, here's my 4 or 5 mana reanimation spell. If I want to be able to tune that up a little bit, I have that flexibility in both directions. Whereas if you've started all the way up against the ceiling, you're kind of trapped there, and there's not a lot of flexibility. And obviously, this is an issue for cube designers that are playing with existing cards. If you were designing a game from scratch, you'd have full flexibility. So I do just want to have a little bit of humility in that we are operating in kind of a restricted space as cube designers.
That to me is the most objective and undeniable fact of playing at a lower power level. It just allows you as the cube designer to have way more influence over realizing the vision you have for your cube environment, making the cards you want to be good, making the sort of games play out the way you want them to play out, making them end on the terms you want them to end. You have way more control over that if you're just working with a broader power level, with a broader card pool, rather, which comes from a low power level. I also think, and this is where we get to the sort of questions of Magic's constants, I think playing with bad cards, especially relative to the constants in Magic, just tends to make things like creature combat matter a lot more in the average game of Magic. If you are playing at really high power levels, then very often the game will be decided by like a card and not, tempo or like slowly chipping away at your opponent's life total or whatever. It'll be decided by this card, which your opponent didn't have the answer for because it's just linearly very powerful. And I found playing a lot of very powerful cubes and a lot of very not powerful cubes, or cubes that are playing a lot of objectively weak cards, that creature combat just matters a lot more in the weaker cubes in my experience, and I think creature combat is maybe one of the most beautiful things about all of Magic. Like, one of the most elegant pieces of game design in terms of how simple it appears, how easy it is to make decisions about, but then how deep the strategy and thinking goes about it. I just think cubes where creature combat matters are, generally speaking, a little more fun than cubes where it doesn't.
I agree. I mean, I like the variety of sometimes drafting a cube where it's like, oh, this is all about finding these like really extreme synergies where I can have explosive decks that are going to win very quickly. But that's the thing I like to do occasionally. And I agree for the most part. I like kind of more incremental gameplay where it's like, okay, I do a thing that is going to pan out after a few turns and I have time to naturally draw through my deck and sort of see what's happening. And I don't necessarily want to conflate and say like lower power means games go longer or games are slower or gameplay is less varied, because I think
games do go longer, generally, on average.
I think you have the opportunity to make them go longer, but I think that it's not necessarily a totally fixed relationship there.
I think the thing at a lower power means that you are sort of foregoing the opportunity for the game to have ended super early. But obviously, in really powerful cubes, games can still go to like super long turns. Like, that is very possible in like some control mirror. It doesn't matter how powerful your cards are. You're going to go to a super late game. The thing that matters is like, how early can I reasonably expect to be dead? And as the power level goes down, that number goes up in terms of number of turns in which you could reasonably expect to be dead. And that opens up a lot of viability for cards and strategies that otherwise might not be able to work, because you just have to plan to maybe be dead by turn 4 or 5 in a really powerful cube, where that's not true in other environments.
That's interesting. I mean, it's funny that when we were trying to define bad cards, we didn't define them in terms of how much do they contribute to how quickly can they threaten a win. I don't know. I'm not sure I totally buy that. Like, I think that it is true in some cases, but I think there are a lot of high-powered gameplay that it's just like, well, the removal matches the threats, so even though everything's powerful, the game's going to be kind of a slog still.
Yeah,
and I think that you
can happen.
Definitely have environments where it's like, this is low power, but my 4-mana 3/3 flyer is actually pretty fast clock, and if the removal stacks up...
but there it's not, because a 4-mana 3/3 flyer is like not going to kill your opponent until what, turn...
Well, what if I have...
If it's alone, it's going to kill your opponent on like what? I could do his math. Turn 10, 11, basically. That's where these constants, I think, do matter. And so I think the Turbo Cube is a great example of like the other extreme. Like, combat could not matter less than that cube. Which is not to say you don't attack or block. You do, but it's like one of the ways that combo can win is by killing you through combat. Or you can combo win with Aetherflux Reservoir, or you can combo win by milling your opponent out, right? Like, it's not like the actual texture of combat matters even a little bit. And it's because the way that the environment works, like, every individual card is so much more powerful. Every individual card is so powerful that it becomes entirely about the cards and not at all about Magic's constants. really it doesn't matter that, you play 1 land a turn or that you start at 20 life. All that matters is that the amount of life you start at is less than Aetherflux Reservoir can kill you, and it's less than a Devilish Valet with 4 other creatures can kill you, right? And those are the numbers you can just change arbitrarily, and it doesn't matter because those things are relational to each other. I just think creature combat matters more, and I also think that creature combat is beautiful. I know you agree with me on this.
Absolutely.
It's so elegant how you have these like relatively simple decisions that have really complex unfolding strategy, and what you can derive from an attack. My opponent attacked this way. What can that possibly say about what they have in their hand, what their plan is for the next turn, and what they think the clock is, and like how they think his game is going to play out. Like, so much information is encoded in such simple decisions in combat that I think it is a beautiful part of the game that should be celebrated. I also think Parker explains this, I think, very succinctly in his article, that we talked about a sort of hallmark of quote-unquote bad cards being that they are often narrow or conditional, and cards that are narrow or conditional mean that they tend to, really contribute to synergistic strategies. If a card is just good in every context, in every moment, in every situation, then you don't need to synergize with it. You just put it in your deck, and you just get to play Uro, and Uro is just always good. Or you play Flage, and Flage is always good. Or you play Minsc and Boo is always good. If your card is Phyrexian Dreadnought, you don't just play Phyrexian Dreadnought and have it be always good. And that's a really, stark example in that card is actively bad unless you have something else going on. But, I'm too take 5 pill to think of any reasonable examples. I'm like, well, you don't just play Sundial the Infinite. It's like you have to combine it with something. Even cards that have like mild downsides or, are just not as strong as normal because they have, some other conditional sort of situation where they shine. A Combat Trick is a great example. Like, Combat Tricks, I think, are fundamentally probably worse cards than average.
I thought you were going to stop at Combat Tricks are fun, and I was going to be shocked.
I'm arguing for them here because Combat Tricks are fundamentally narrow. You have to be in combat, generally speaking, for them to matter at all. And they usually only matter depending on how your opponent has blocked, which is something you don't have control over. By being conditional, that means that you need something to go right in order for them to work. But if you can make a cube where you can draft a deck where, we shouldn't get derailed on Combat Tricks, but the thing about Combat Tricks is that you have so little control over when they're good. It doesn't really matter how you draft and deck build to like synergistically make the Combat Tricks good. It kind of just matters like what your opponent's doing and like what sort of part of the game you happen to find yourself at. But the broader idea here is that if a card is bad because its rate is not that good unless you, satisfy this weird edge case, 1 in every 10 times you cast it, condition, or it doesn't do anything except for this one spot, and you can work to make those cards good. I think a lot of players really love synergistic gameplay. We hear about this a lot in cube descriptions. Lots of people describe their cube as a highly synergistic cube, and then I look at it and I'm like, all these cards are individually cracked. I don't really see how I'm going to be synergizing with any of these when you're playing Magic's most powerful cards, but if you say you love synergy, then the best way to sort of capitalize on that is to play cards that essentially require synergizing to put them above rate for the environment you're in.
Yeah, it's also a way to just sort of activate more of the cards in a particular environment. Like we talked about, okay, only some percentage of a particular pool is going to be relevant to a constructed format. Like what that actual percentage is, it's probably going to be falling in the same ballpark a lot, but I think it can change. And the thing that changes it is how much the context and the synergistic context matters. And are there cards that generally this would be an F. You don't want to put this in your deck ever, unless you build a very specific deck and suddenly it's like a really key component. And the more you have those kinds of cards that aren't just like, yep, this card has enough rate so it goes in the deck, but it's like, this is a thing I need to work for, it's just going to activate more of that card pool and increase how much of that card pool is relevant.
Another big virtue of playing with bad cards, I think, is, we've kind of addressed this already, but like to say it more concretely, like you get so much more control over like what decides games, right? I think a lot about Alex's oldest school, where he's just made 5-drop creatures with no guaranteed value against removal the best thing in the cube. And like games are decided by Sarah Angel or Sengir Vampire or
I love to
whatever.
Cast Sengir Vampire and have my opponent's expression just wilt.
It's just beautiful that he's created an environment where like the way in which games end is so alien to modern Magic. Like most modern Magic games don't end because your opponent resolved a 5-drop and is going to attack you 4 times with it and you have nothing to do about it, right? You can, listening, decide whether you like that or not. You might think that sounds terrible, but the point that you can actually accomplish that by playing bad cards and saying, no, I'm going to make sure that all these cards are always worse than Sarah Angel or Shivan Dragon or Sengir Vampire, that means you get to like create a whole new type of gameplay where it's like, I'm going to survive so I can play my Sarah Angel, and then I'm going to like turn the corner. Like I'm a Sarah Angel control deck where I just want to resolve my 4/4 vigilance, which is OP in this sort of context. you get total control over that. You get to make whatever cards you want shine, as long as you don't succumb to the temptation of playing better cards that are not those cards you want to shine, right? Like, you have to really commit to those cards being the ones that you care about and want to highlight. Like, so many people's pet cards are so often the worst cards in their cube, right? Like, how often do you see that where it's like, well, this is a cube with like all the best cards and some of my pet cards. And it's like, okay, well, cool, but we're all just going to look at your pet cards in our sideboard for the whole night. Like, it's not the same as making us play with them. Like,
which, as we've talked about before,
has its own value.
You get to see them more often in the draft.
Has its own value.
But yeah, I mean, if you want them to also be part of the gameplay, you can. It just takes sometimes some very deliberate restraint to say, like, okay, well, I'm not going to put in just the better option for XYZ. I'm going to make sure I am, like, keeping that goal in mind as I'm constructing everything around it.
Yeah, make your pet cards the best cards in the cube, I think, is one of the virtues of playing with bad cards. I also think, and this is a little more sort of fuzzy, but to me, I think the last benefit that I'll say to playing in defense of playing with bad cards is that I think we've kind of discovered as a cube community collectively that, like, recontextualization is really fun, right? Like, all these emblem cubes or other sort of rules modified cubes, they're, I think, fundamentally fun because it's really exciting to look at, you know, a thing you recognize and have to, like, put it in a new context and say, okay, well, I know what this card does, but now its cost is reduced by 2, or now the first spell I cast each turn has Cascade, or now I start with a copy of Pillar of the Perins in play, right? Like, that sort of hoop of, like, recontextualizing something you know is, like, a very satisfying thing to do as a player. And I do think that just playing with bad cards is a really easy, low-stakes way to recontextualize everything, right? And this is kind of the same point. It's like, you know, make your pet cards the best cards in the cube, but, like, if you want to recontextualize, you know, a 5-mana 4/4 with flying, put it in the oldest school, and now all of a sudden, like, a card that is, like, utterly forgettable, you know, D- limited filler, or completely unplayable in, like, most cubes, just like most cubes that exist by number, becomes, like, a premier threat that, you know, you shape your entire draft around. And getting to do that recontextualization and, like, think about, you know, Phantasmal Forces is a card that I think has actually maybe since been cut from the oldest school because it was too good. It was like a 4/1 flyer with upkeep cost of blue and cost 3 mana, 2 and a blue. Am I right about that?
Costs 4 mana for a 4/1 flyer. But
okay.
A 4/1 flyer is pretty good.
That card was so good in that cube, and that's the kind of card where I've never seen it before, and normally I would think this card is awful, because it is awful. It's a bad card in most contexts, but again, in the context that Alex created in the oldest school, was like, no, in a world of Sarah Angels, I think this is kind of messed up. I mean, it actually does line up great against Sarah Angel. Like, getting to trade with their Sarah Angel is great. You want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's worth mentioning that we're talking about some pretty extreme examples of recontextualization, where either you're pulling from a card pool of, like, all cards that are printed before the year 2000. That's a pretty extreme restriction, but it's still very, I don't know, it's in bounds. You don't have to explain anything to people. It's just, here's the cards, let's draft them. You can also do very extreme things like alter the fundamental rules of the game. You can also make more subtle recontextualizations. I think just even in my regular cube, which plays a lot like a slightly powered up, more synergistic limited format, the idea of looking at that and being like, okay, well, actually, card advantage is kind of hard to come by here. Like, I'm going to have to rethink how much do I value Maze Mind Tome. Is that actually going to be a really valuable piece here? Or, you know, how aggressive are the fastest decks, which are going to impact my evaluation of different cards? So there is a spectrum of how extreme you want to push the recontextualization. And I think there's a lot to be explored on that slight end of that spectrum.
And the last thing I'll say, which I think is a lesson from the ball pit, which we've mentioned on the show before, is, like, I think so often with quote-unquote bad cards, conditional weird cards, if you find yourself mid-game with that card in your hand, you might actually find that it does something more often than you would expect. I think as players, we are so conditioned to, you know, really harshly cut down our curves and, like, make our deck as, like, lean and efficient and consistent as possible. And so a lot of these cards end up on the cutting room floor because you're like, well, that's not going to happen that often. But the ball pit, a cube where you have to play with every single card you draft, even all your last picks, sometimes you find, like, actually, this last pick kind of does something right now. And that's, I think, a fun moment. And that same fun moment can happen just by putting lower powered cards in your cube, but enough lower powered cards that they're still making main decks because you haven't just put a couple in and have them all be riding sideboards.
I would say one more advantage to playing with cheap cards that's maybe the most obvious one. Maybe we should have started with this, but the good cards are deemed good.
You said cheap cards at the beginning, so you kind of showed your hand. You didn't say bad cards. You said cheap cards.
Yeah, well, the cards that are deemed good in constructed formats are also fairly desirable, so it can be much easier to acquire the quote-unquote bad cards. And playing them in cube, I think that, you know, I think there really is not a downside. I think there's just more space to explore, and that's just an added boon.
For sure. So in conclusion, Playing with bad cards is great. You all should do it more. And the best way to do it by far is playing Cube, where you don't have to deal with other people's. You don't have to deal with some rule zero conversation where you're like, oh, we're going to play these bad cards and nobody's going to do anything mean. Nobody's going to take an extra turn. Nobody's going to steal my stuff. Nobody's going to destroy my land. Nobody's going to counter my spell. You don't have to have any of those conversations. You just shuffle up and play. And on that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. This is our second to last show of the year. Our last show of the year is going to be a little recap, as we do every year. Look back on the year for the show, the year for us and our relationship to the game, etc. more broadly. So check that out next week, and then we'll see you in 2026. I can't believe it's the end of the year already.
Went by so fast.
I guess this is
weird.
The Christmas episode. Merry Christmas if you celebrate.
Happy winter solstice.
If you're listening to this in the car on your drive home for the holidays with your partner, I am sorry, partner, that you had to listen to this.
Hopefully you enjoyed that bit about wolves. Check out that podcast.
Yeah. We should do a whole Magic Doesn't Exist about Andrew Tate.
I don't want to know that much about him.
Yeah. I know too much about him.
Every time I know a little bit more about him, I'm like, I didn't need to know that.
He's such a garbage person. Anyway, all the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty. The show is edited by Matthew. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. If we got any of the rules text wrong about the cards in this episode, we did that completely on purpose to get you to leave comments on social media, thus boosting the visibility of these episodes for the algorithm, so you fell for it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thanks for talking about bad Magic cards with me. It's time for us to go Cube.
Play some bad Magic cards. Like Gil. I want to open more power this time. I liked my deck last time, but I had very little power. I can't complain. I 3-0'd last time, but I didn't get to take a bunch of game actions with my deck. I didn't get to look at my deck. My favorite thing to do.
You did 3-0, and definitively.
It was pretty decisive.
Decisively.
Yeah. And I passed an egg.
That's crazy. Why'd you do that?
I took something that is not power, but was very good for my deck. I can look at my list and remember what it was, but I remember being like, I feel crazy, but I passed an off-color egg for something that just felt good in pack 3. And I think it was correct.
Sometimes you gotta do it.